Hello, and thank you for ordering Vibrance Gut Zoomer 3.0. Because this test is so new, the technology is so state of the art and cutting edge, and because the report formatting has some very unique intricacies, we wanted to provide this brief walkthrough video to get you started using this fantastic clinical tool. The objectives for this presentation are to provide a walkthrough of Vibrance GutZoomer 3.0, all of its parts and pieces and biomarkers. We want to connect the dots using the data derived from this test and align the stool test findings to patients' clinical symptoms. In doing so, we will present a case study where we can snap together the results from the GutZoomer with Vibrance intestinal permeability, food sensitivity, and micronutrient testing from a live patient case. We will then finish up with suggested therapeutic interventions and next steps. To look inside Vibrance GutZoomer 3.0, I best describe this test in three different sections. Part one are our commensal bacteria measurements and data and summative results. Part two are the pathogens, and part three are the functional markers. It should be noted that all of the microorganism testing, both the commensals and the pathogens, are measured on Vibrant's proprietary microarray platform and our DNA-based testing, whereas our functional markers are all performed on mass spectrometry. There is an immense amount of data provided in the GutZoomer 3.0, but the lab has done a very nice job of summarizing this data into three very concise, very actionable pages. And a lot of our practitioners really choose to stick to those 3 pages when they're presenting the information with a patient so that we don't get a sense of kind of analysis paralysis. We don't get lost in the nuances of all the taxonomy of bacteria. The information is there, and a lot of our practitioners that really want to do a deep dive into the commensals and pathogens as well can certainly do so. But we'll talk you through how to use these first 3 summary pages to really give you the meat and potatoes of what you're looking for in terms of clinical data. So before we get started, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an FYI on who Vibrant is as a company. The company was founded in 2011. It is a CLIA and CAP accredited clinical lab, and that is huge. Not most labs in the functional space hold both of those accreditations. The lab itself is located in San Carlos, California. And we have many research collaborations with some of the leading research institutes in the country, including Mayo, University of Washington, Columbia, Stanford, University of North Carolina, Virginia Tech, and Scripps. And we've partnered with these collaborations to derive a lot of our samples that we use in our validations and also in some of our publications. The company kind of operates in 2 arms. We have the Vibrant America arm and the Vibrant Wellness arm. The GutZoomer 3.0 is ordered under Vibrant Wellness. And our technology really sets us apart as a clinical lab. The bread and butter of Vibrant Wellness testing is our microarray platform, which allows for a very high accuracy and sensitivity and specificity for both antibody antigen detection as it relates to some of our antibody tests, and also for DNA as it relates to this GutZoomer. All of our microchips are synthesized in a high facility clean room, and we are able to test a variety of specimen, including serum, plasma, urine, blood, DNA, RNA, which we derive from tissue and stool, as is the case with this test we're speaking of today. And I just wanted to give some pearls about the DNA platform that we use for this GutZoomer test. I feel like the nuances of DNA testing, kind of the vocabulary gets kind of thrown around and convoluted in terms of, not all DNA platforms are created equal. Providers use the term PCR kind of colloquially, meaning that it is a DNA test. But that being said, not all DNA platforms are created equal. And what Vibrant is able to do on our microchip is what we're calling a microarray hybridization. So we are actually able to measure the entire DNA from all microorganisms tested. And this includes 16S and 23S regions, but is not limited to those regions of the DNA. And what we're essentially able to do is unwind a DNA strand, and we have this tiled onto our microchips. So we've been able to basically, if we think back to biology 101 and the DNA double helix, we've essentially been able to tile 50% of the DNA strand onto our microarray platform. So we know what we're looking for. And then when a patient's sample is run against our microchip, we're essentially able to match the DNA with complementary base pairs. And so we are able to detect the microorganisms with a unprecedented degree of sensitivity and specificity. And I'll show you here in the next slide a recent publication that was produced in October of 2019, citing this specificity and sensitivity. And it is, it kind of blows most of our competition out of the water in terms of the accuracy of what we were able to do. With platforms that just measure 16S RNA, there is some overlapping 16S fragments among different microorganisms, so that highly, those a DNA platform that just tests 16S is not going to be nearly as specific as what we're able to afford here. And here is the publication that I was alluding to just a second ago. Again, this is from October of 2019, where this is specific for our pathogens panel in particular, but Vibrant has validated its technology platform with a 96% sensitivity and 100% specificity for identifying these individual microorganisms. And that's higher accuracy than you're going to find anywhere else in the industry today. So before we begin a discussion of the report itself and what is found within these pages, I just wanted to draw your attention to the GutZoomer interpretation guide. This is a resource that our clinical team has put together from, the years of experience in working with previous iterations of the GutZoomer and other, kind of gut specific tools. This is a fantastic tool for you to use. I highly recommend printing this out and keeping it with you. It's something that I have a hard copy of in front of me every time I look at a test. Too often we get providers on the phone for consult reviews and they're unaware of this resource or they haven't looked at it. It's about 47 pages of fantastic information. We take you through taxonomy of the different microbiota. We discuss all the different diversity scores and ratios that we're measuring here. We have a really nice several pages on dietary factors, prebiotics, and polyphenols that can be used to improve gut health with cautions with FODMAPs. And we take you through all the different functional markers and how to use those as well. So please do not pass go without downloading this resource and having this as a companion guide when you're reviewing GutZoomer 3.0 results. All right, so part one of the test comprises our commensal bacteria. And this is really one of the areas where Vibrant has its strengths. Now, we already talked about our technology platform, and what that allows us to do is measure an extremely high abundance of microorganisms. So from a commensal space, we're talking about over 150 unique commensal microorganisms, and we report those at both the genus and the species level. We use this commensal bacteria to give individual results of two different diversity scores, the Shannon's index and the Simpson's index. And we also group these commensals into 11 disease state associations. So we can kind of use these, what I call dysbiosis patterns, to align with a patient's clinical symptoms, to kind of use this test as a roadmap tool in that regard. And then with these disease state associations, we have suggested therapeutic protocols where we're again giving a CFU count for those commercially available probiotics so that we are really able to individualize a probiotic recommendation if that is appropriate for the case at hand. We also have a phylum distribution based on these commensals and also key ratios. So this is certainly a deep dive. I know a lot of the other stool tests on the market are very focused in the pathogen space and identification of pathogens. And this test, our test here at Vibrant does that as well. But really where our test outshines is the amount of commensals that we are measuring and the patterns and associations that we are able to group these commensals into. So let's talk a little bit about these diversity scores. So it's well known that ecosystems, and I encourage you all, when we talk about the microbiome and we talk about, a stool profile measuring these different microorganisms, we have to think of them in the construct of an ecosystem, because that's very much what it is. And when we're talking about an ecosystem, ecosystems have strength in diversity. Diversity being the probability that two randomly selected species in a population will be different. And, this is well-established ecological principles. And so the Shannon's index and the Simpson's index are well-established ecological tools to define diversity. The Shannon's index is a better indication of richness. It's based on a scale of 0 to 3. Whereas the Simpson's index is a better indication of evenness, meaning that it gives more weight to a dominant species. So some random species that are less abundant in the ecosystem are not going to have as much influence. So we would kind of expect the Simpson's index to get knocked down if there's like a pathogen outcompeting the ecosystem, or even just sort of like Proteobacteria overgrowth or gram-negative overgrowth that's really kind of just out competing and dominating the species. Whereas the Shannon's index is an assessment of richness, basically just how many different organisms are in the population. It's very common to see low levels of both of these indices when we're reviewing patient results. It's actually very rare that we see somebody with optimal diversity indices, especially both of them within the optimal range. So at a glance, usually when we see results, one of the primary goals that are set in improving the microbiome health is to improve these diversity scores. We also give a phyla distribution wheel, and this is pretty interesting. Vibrant is probably the first commercial lab that has been able to look at this many organisms at the DNA level, especially with our microarray hybridization. So there isn't an immense amount of data showing phylum distributions of this kind. So at this point, we can't really say what is ideal in terms of what your phyla distribution looks like. The firmicutes and the Bacteroidetes phyla are the two most dominant phyla in the human gut. So we're always going to see that purple section and that blue section kind of comprising the largest amount of the phyla distribution. One way I do like to use this tool is in identifying the Proteobacteria. Proteobacteria are a well-known gram-negative phylum that house, quite a few of our pathogens are in the Proteobacteria phylum. And even if they're not pathogenic infectious organisms, they are microorganisms that may carry a more powerful or virulent LPS. So sometimes if we see, a higher abundance or a higher percentage of Proteobacteria, that may be sort of foreshadowing what's to come. We may have sort of a inflammatory dysbiosis, or maybe also, the presence of a positive pathogen or pathobiont. So it's been kind of interesting to look at these phyla wheels but it's another way of classifying kind of diversity and balance within the microbiome. And then we have grouped the commensal organisms that we're measuring into these 11 different disease state associations for which we give individualized scores. So you can read here, we have a disease state association for intestinal permeability, cardiovascular health, metabolic health, neurological disease, IBD, hormone regulation, SIBO, autoimmune, nutrition, liver diseases, and IBS. So I always relate these back to what I call dysbiosis patterns. If a person has an elevated score for something like intestinal permeability, they have a dysbiosis pattern that can be somewhat predictive of intestinal permeability or suggestive of intestinal permeability, or what literature suggests aligns with other patient populations that are diagnosed with intestinal permeability. So we can kind of use this again as a roadmap to align the gut flora and the picture of the microbiome with clinical symptoms for the patients. These are not diagnostic scores. So we are not going to be diagnosing our patients with an autoimmune condition based on their stool profile. We cannot diagnose SIBO based on a stool profile. SIBO is a manifestation of the small bowel, and obviously with a stool collection, we're looking at the ecosystem of the colonic microbiome. However, these are all very research-derived scores, data-derived tools, where again, we're just helping you understand that clinical correlation of the dysbiosis patterns and these disease states. I will mention here too, in the comments section, we summarize all the scores that are out of range. So every score that's in the yellow or the red, we'll sort of draw that out here in a long list. And then we also list out suggested probiotics. And these recommendations are obtained from the individual sections where we are measuring the commercially available probiotic species that are known to be corrective for these clinical conditions above. And I'll illustrate this more in a couple slides. So you are able to, get a sense of these dysbiosis patterns, and also we are providing a summary of the commercially available probiotics that can be corrective of these conditions, and we're giving an individualized result for these. So for this patient in particular, these are the probiotics that were low abundant in this patient's gut that can be corrective for what is it? 5, 6, 7, 8 different scores above where we're seeing kind of a dysbiosis pattern. Part 2 of the test is our pathogens panel, and we have a very diverse array of pathogenic microorganisms we're testing for, divided into 22 pathogenic bacteria, 24 intestinal parasites, 11 viruses, 5 fungal species, 5 worms, and 6 antibiotic-resistant genes. There is a validated pathogenic limit of detection for each organism, which demarks it as a infectious organism. Of course, some of these bacteria that we're measuring may be an innate part of the gut flora, but it's when that organism becomes kind of overgrown and outcompeting the ecosystem where it becomes quote unquote infectious or pathogenic. Candida albicans is an example of such an organism. Remember the publication that I alluded to earlier this year, October of 2019, citing the specificity and sensitivity of our pathogen platform. And each pathogen, for each reported pathogen, or even if it's below the limit of detection, we will give a quantified CFU count for each organism. On previous versions of the test, we had just listed the result as either detected or non-detected, and we got a lot of feedback that our providers really wanted to see that actual result or CFU count. So we've provided that here on the 3.0 version, and I think that that's definitely a positive addition to the test. And part 3 of the test are what I call the functional markers. And these are familiar to many of you, but they may not be familiar to all of you. So we are looking at markers of inflammation, predominantly fecal calprotectin, markers of digestive function, looking at pancreatic elastase and bile acid metabolites. And then we are looking at commensal bacteria metabolites such as short chain fatty acids and beta-glucuronidase, and that certainly plays into some of those disease state association scores we just looked at, whether it be the intestinal permeability or hormone regulation as well. And this is a very busy slide with a lot of words. And remember, we do have that very expansive resource guide that can take you through kind of the definitions of all of these functional markers, as I call them. But just to kind of give it to you here in one slide, if you're not familiar with some of these or have never worked with them before, calprotectin is a very well-known industry-accepted marker of intestinal inflammation. It's fairly non-specific, so it is used as part of a diagnostic workup or evaluation in patients that are suspected with inflammatory bowel disease or non-specific intestinal inflammation. It is not on its own diagnostic, but it's a very nice tool. And we don't always see calprotectin elevated, but when it is, that's a fairly significant indication that we certainly have inflammation in the GI tract that we need to abate. And as far as markers of digestive function, pancreatic elastase is used alongside other tests to evaluate pancreatic insufficiency. So we know that the pancreas is a primary source of many of our digestive enzymes. And so a low level of pancreatic elastase basically relates to the inability of the pancreas to produce and transport enough digestive enzymes to do adequate protein breakdown of our food. I will say that usually if pancreatic elastase is low, that does indicate kind of a more severe digestive insufficiency. And the bile acid metabolites, these are nice markers. You don't see these on every single stool test in the market, but realizing so bile acids are synthesized in the liver from cholesterol into two primary bile acids, which are then worked on by some of our anaerobic bacteria, specifically the Clostridium and the Eubacteria, so that these primary bile acids can convert into secondary bile acids. And these secondary bile acids can give us some indication if they are elevated. They can be potentially cytotoxic, and they have some associations with colon cancer and gallstone formation. And in the case of bile acid malabsorption, these bile acids get ineffectively reabsorbed from the terminal ileum, and that stimulates bile acid synthesis from the liver, resulting in increased concentration of both serum and fecal bile acids. So it's kind of this sort of vicious cycle, and we can kind of get a sense of that ineffective reabsorption by looking at these markers in the stool. As far as metabolites, so short chain fatty acids are probably fairly familiar to both of us, but these are one of the primary, it's arguable that producing short chain fatty acids is one of the most important functions of our microbiota or the gut bugs in a healthy gut. And so these short chain fatty acids are used to fuel our enterocytes, and give them a source of energy, and also kind of correct and repair when there is damage or inflammation. So our test reports a percentage of 4 different short chain fatty acids: the butyrate, the acetate, propionate, and valurate. And then we also give a gram amount of total short chain fatty acids in that stool sample, and we're actually measuring a total of about 13 different short chain fatty acids. So personally, I like to look at that gram amount as sort of the be all end all there. And then beta-glucuronidase is something that a lot of practitioners are not familiar with or have not worked with prior. And this is an enzyme that is produced by anaerobic gut bacteria, and these anaerobes are part of our commensal flora, and it is regarded as a generalized marker of dysbiosis. But basically, we're looking for elevations in beta-glucuronidase because this is an enzyme that is responsible for conjugating different toxic compounds, whether they be carcinogens, lipid hormones, or steroid hormones. Estrogen is a good example, that gets sort of conjugated so that it can then be excreted from the body. And beta-glucuronidase sort of uncouples these conjugations. So it essentially frees these toxins. So instead of being excreted from the body, they're now able to recirculate. And so kind of goes back to conversations about total toxic burden and kind of relates the whole, gut health and gut balance and gut diversity back to our ability to cleanse the body and remove toxins from the body. So those are our functional markers, and there's a lot more I can say about them. They're more fully elucidated in our interpretation guide, but just wanted to give you some tidbits right here. So now let's put it to the test. Let's actually use this GutZoomer 3.0 as a clinical tool. And I'm going to present to you here a real-time case that I consulted on with one of our ordering practitioners using the GutZoomer 3.0, in addition to some other Vibrant labs. So this was a 73-year-old female. Her primary complaint was long history of diarrhea, intermittent, no identified triggers. She has been through, ups and downs with elimination diet, experimentation, really with no success. She has not really been able to dial in any specific triggers for her symptoms. And currently she's, as we see with a lot of our patients in this space, currently she's following what she claims to be a very limited diet, which is actually really impairing her quality of life. She reports mild depression, basically related to these unresolved symptoms of diarrheal distress and also dietary restriction. And she also has some generalized feelings of unwell, some fatigue, etc. So this sounds like, probably we can all think of a patient like this that has walked into our office before. So the provider also ran blood work in addition to the GutZoomer. She ran a wheat zoomer, which did show significant and acute intestinal permeability, in addition to high degree of reactivity to gluten and wheat, despite the patient reporting she was following a gluten-free diet. So I'll show you the screenshots here and we'll talk about that. She also ran a 96 food sensitivity panel, which lit up like a Christmas tree. And I'll talk you through kind of how I interpret that in light of the pancreatic elastase marker and also the protein level sensitivity versus our Zoomers, which offer peptide level sensitivity. She also ran a micronutrient on the patient, which showed several intracellular nutrient deficiencies and low lymphocytes, suboptimal CoQ10 and glutathione, kind of relating back to this kind of conversation about toxic burden, and also low serum and low intracellular vitamin K2. We know that K2 is actually produced in the gut, so that's another association we can make. So here are some of the screenshots from the other labs. Looking at her intestinal permeability panel, we see elevated both IgG and IgA antibodies to zonulin. That's something you don't see every day. It's common to see IgG antibodies to zonulin, but when we see the IgA, that's definitely telling us that this is a very acute permeability, because those IgA half-life is really only about a week or so in the bloodstream. Also has IgG antibodies to actin, which can be related to, again, kind of intestinal inflammation, kind of enterocyte destruction, apoptosis, if you will. So this would be considered a pretty acute permeability, an intestinal permeability score of 4.4 out of 6. And then we come over here to the individual antigens that tested reactive on her wheat zoomer score. And remember, this is a patient who has gone down a whole bunch of rabbit trails of food elimination diets and is reporting that she's currently avoiding gluten among other foods, and is feeling overly restrictive as a consequence. But this is something we see all the time. We see a highly reactive wheat zoomer, despite the patient being gluten-free. And again, we do see IgA antibodies positive in addition to IgG antibodies positive to the gliadin and the glutenin, which indicates, you know, acute intake of gluten. So whether or not this is intentional or unintentional, maybe she's getting some, unintentional exposure or some cross-contamination. The meat of the matter here is that, she's got a high risk wheat zoomer score despite following a gluten-free diet. So that's some education we need to talk her through. And we can certainly look at these intestinal permeability markers next to her stool profile, and that'll shed some nice light. And this is her 96 food sensitivity test. Now remember, our food sensitivity test, the antigens we're using are protein extracts. So these are full protein food sensitivities. And this is a highly reactive test. That's kind of what I was saying. It's really lit up like a Christmas tree, both with IgGs and IgA positives. And usually when I see a test like this, my first thoughts are, this is somewhat downstream of number one, intestinal permeability, but number two, likely some digestive insufficiency, seeing as though, we really should not have this much intact protein entering the bloodstream if the gut is healed and sealed appropriately, and if we're digesting our foods down to the peptide level appropriately as well. So, this is kind of painting that picture of digestive insufficiency in my mind, but certainly, kind of the first step is we need to take this supposedly, very restrictive diet that the patient's already following, and look at that through the lens of this test and sort of come up with a prioritization, based on the IgAs, which may be driving mucosal irritation, compared to the IgGs, which, may be more downstream. And now we can move on to her gut zoomer and see what those results did for us. So this is the page 1 of the summary report, and you can see she's got an extremely low diversity as a whole. Both the Shannons and the Simpsons are red level low. So, what is the name of the game to help improve the health of the microbiome? To increase diversity. So absolutely, that's a pearl we need to work on. Remember what I said about the phyla wheel? We really don't derive a lot of actionable steps from the phyla, but I do think it's interesting to look at. And I will note that her Proteobacteria, which remember is a category of gram-negative bacteria that sometimes carry those virulent LPS, as a component of their cell wall. It's 12.4% of her microbiome. So to me, that's that's foreshadowing what's to come, because that's kind of a high percentage of Proteobacteria just based on, the amount of these that we've looked at. Her firm-acute bacteroidetes ratio and Prevotella bacteroidetes ratio are both out of whack as well, and that relates to low diversity and dysbiosis. And then we can kind of pick apart these disease state associations and scores. You see that more of them are out of whack than in whack. So we can certainly go to these sections that have an elevated score of a dysbiosis pattern. And again, individualized probiotic recommendations are summarized here, so that if we were going to be giving this patient probiotic recommendations, these comments would help us really tailor the specific product she needs, but specifically the specific species that she would need, including Saccharomyces boulardii in some cases, Lactobacillus, Streptococcus, and Bifidobacterium species as well. Actually, interestingly enough, her gut, most of her Bifido looked pretty good. It's mostly these Lactobacillus strains and the Sac B that's out of whack. Interestingly enough, no pathogens detected. And I'm pretty sure that when the provider ran this test, because of the symptoms of, the intermittent diarrhea, she was suspecting a pathogen, and that happens a lot. A lot of providers really just kind of have this pathogen detection lens on, but we're not quite grasping the concept of the fact that commensal dysbiosis, that looks like this on a report, can have really adverse symptoms for the gut. It's not always just about picking up infectious bugs. So, I do have that conversation with practitioners frequently when we talk about these tests and do consults for review. We can look at her functional markers, and here we see some interesting results. So she does have a moderately elevated calprotectin, not outrageous, but definitely higher than, the cut point of 50 that we like to see. So that's telling us she certainly has some inflammation inside her gut lumen. And she's got a very low level of pancreatic elastase. Now, remember that food sensitivity test. Remember how many positive protein level antigens were on that food sensitivity test. And I was already suspecting some digestive insufficiency just looking at that. But now we kind of have further proof of this in that there's definitely some deficiency in digestive enzymes. The bile acid metabolites actually look pretty good, all within normal range. And the short chain fatty acids here, also, if we look at the individual percentages, these look okay. But if we look at the total amount of short chain fatty acids, we do see that it's low normal. We want that number over 45, and this is around 30. So all in all, she's got a low level of total short chain fatty acids in the gut, which can certainly compromise the health of the enterocytes. And beta-glucuronidase, so this is a remarkably high beta-glucuronidase level. I don't think I've ever seen a level this high. The provider that I was consulting with certainly had not. So we need to kind of take a deeper dive into what is going on here. And with this elevated level, we're kind of questioning how well, kind of what this patient's toxic burden it looks like. And then we also want to look at the dysbiosis patterns, because beta-glucuronidase, of course, is produced by anaerobic bacteria, and Vibrant measures all of the bacteria that produce that. So we'll see that pattern here in a second. And so I wanted to talk you through some of the individual sections for disease state associations. Remember, I said that, the 2 slides, or 3 slides rather, that I've previously showed you, this is basically summary page 1, summary page 2, summary page 3. And a lot of our providers really do like to just stick to these summary pages because it's easier, it's readable, and it's really the meat and potatoes of what you want to know and the information you want to share with the patient. But if you want to do a deeper dive into these commensals to look at these disease state associations, you're certainly welcome to do so. And I personally, I always take a look at them because it can shed light on where some of the dysbiosis is coming from. She has very low levels of Akkermansia mucinophilia. And if you don't know anything about Akkermansia, Akkermansia is one of the more researched anaerobic commensals. Mucinophilia in Latin means mucin lover. So this is a major player in the health of the mucosal layer in the gut that can kind of regulate inflammation. It's also sort of a director of overall diversity. So it's pretty common to see low levels of Akkermansia. I will say this is a remarkably low level of Akkermansia. And unfortunately, because it's anaerobic, not something that we're going to be able to correct with a supplement, but Akkermansia is known to respond really well to dietary and lifestyle changes like polyphenols in the diet, particularly the red polyphenols, and also intermittent fasting habits. Akkermansia can actually increase in the fasting state. So there's a nice body of literature there as well. Remember that she did have lower short chain fatty acids, and here we do look at some of the commensals that produce those short chain fatty acids. So again, if we are able to increase these diversity and bring up some of these guys, we may be able to improve those short chain fatty acids. Her butyrate itself was not insanely low, but I don't think it would be wrong to use something like a butyrate supplementation in this regard either. We can look at the SIBO piece. Remember, this test is not necessarily diagnostic for SIBO, but here we look at some of the hydrogen and methane producers that can be correlated with the SIBO state. And I don't know if this patient necessarily, is a SIBO candidate. We may not. I think there's a lot of other fish to fry looking at the data given to us here in terms of the intestinal permeability, the digestive insufficiency, and just the gut dysbiosis. But interestingly to look at, and I did want to show you, these are the bacteria associated with SIBO, and then these are the probiotic organisms that can be corrective for SIBO. And you can see she has low levels of Lactobacillus plantarum, and that's why Lactobacillus plantarum is one of those probiotics that populated in the comments on that first page of the summary. So each section is tiled out like this, and then the summary page provides, kind of pulls each of the low commercially available probiotics out, so you have it all there on one page. Here is IBD. Now remember, this patient has elevated calprotectin moderately, and she has intermittent diarrhea. We can't use this to diagnose her with IBD, but it may be cause for, further workup. I will highlight, again, we see kind of that very low level of Akkermansia. She also has very low level of Faecalibacterium, which is another sort of major player anaerobe that is directive of overall diversity. This guy's very sensitive to antibiotic use. So, in a 73-year-old woman, likely there's been a decent amount of antibiotics throughout life. So these two right here are probably one of the reasons why she's sitting at such a low level of both of those diversity scores. She also has elevated levels of Veillonella, which is not a pathogen in and of itself. It's kind of falls in that pathobiont category. It is Proteobacteria. It does carry an LPS, and elevated levels of Veillonella are associated with Crohn's disease. So again, we're not diagnosing her here, but she does have this dysbiosis pattern, which is similar to somebody with diagnosed inflammatory bowel disease. So it does sort of make sense. And then here are the probiotic organisms that can be therapeutic, and we pull out the ones that she's preferentially low in. And here's the hormone section, and I wanted to bring this up because of that very high level of beta-glucuronidase that we saw from her stool culture. And we do measure the beta-glucuronidase and beta-galactosidase producing bacteria, and she does have elevated levels of these bacteria, which makes sense. And again, we would approach this by just trying to restore the balance here and bring up some of these, commensals to drive down some of these disfavorable bacteria and hopefully restore the balance and bring up those diversity scores. So that, again, was a lot of information, but hey, when you start running 3, 4, 5 of our tests through Vibrant Labs, you get tons of information, which is great. So it's really important to be able to kind of snap it all together and look at those patterns across. So just looking at the gut zoomer results specifically, what are our takeaways? It's negative for all pathogens, significantly low diversity scores, indicating reduced richness and evenness. Overgrowth of Proteobacteria, which alludes to inflammation patterns, elevated calprotectin, which alludes to inflammation patterns, very low level of pancreatic elastase, which alludes to digestive insufficiency. And we saw that protein level food sensitivity test that was lit up like a Christmas tree. So, from my stance, we're not going to make that patient painstakingly avoid all 40 something foods that were lit up. We need to heal the gut, and we need to correct the digestive insufficiency, and that's going to get us, further than just stressing her out further with these intense eliminations. She also had that markedly high beta-glucuronidase, which we've kind of discussed at length. And just remember that this enzyme is produced by gut bacteria, and she did have elevated levels of those gut bacteria collectively. She also has low levels of some of these primary keystone anaerobic species like the Akkermansia mucinophilia and Faecalibacterium protenitzii. And then she does have these dysbiosis patterns suggestive of IBS, IBD, SIBO, digestive insufficiency, and the increased levels of beta-glucuronidase. And so what do we do about it? And I've kind of dropped pearls here throughout this presentation, but first and foremost, we need to correct the intestinal permeability. So we've got to get gluten out of the diet. We saw her very reactive wheat zoomer despite being gluten-free. So that needs to be a conversation. What does gluten-free mean to you? How compliant are you? Are you asking the right questions when you leave the house? Is your house gluten-free? Do you intentionally cheat? Is this something that you might be consuming regularly that maybe has gluten by another name that the patient's not realizing? There's so much education that goes into this to get a patient to effectively remove gluten for good. We probably want to, use some gut healing support supplements because we did see that very acute intestinal permeability protocol. So whatever that looks like to you, usually some combination of glutamine and zinc carnosine, maybe some immunoglobulins to lock those tight junctions in place. Maybe you're using some mucolytics and things like that. There's a variety of protocols out there. And of course, supporting the gut flora is a big part of improving the intestinal permeability. So we can pull out the probiotic recommendations from the report. We also have to support the anaerobes like the Akkermansia, which we already discussed, and we can do that with a variety of diet and lifestyle techniques such as supportive polyphenols and intermittent fasting. Something that I find gets left out of conversation a lot is making sure we're not consuming a lot of antibiotic-laden foods through conventional meats, conventional dairy. I think that's a big reason why a lot of us do have low gut diversity is because we're taking in low levels of antibiotics through our foods unintentionally all the time in our current food supply. And then, of course, diversifying plant-based fibers and polyphenols as tolerated. We want to improve those short-chain fatty acids. We could also use a butyrate supplement. And then we have to support her digestion. Clearly, that is a big part of the problem. We saw that pretty low level. I think it was 129 for pancreatic elastase. That's a pretty stark deficiency there. So we probably want to give her some digestive enzyme support or supportive herbs, do some counseling to improve functional digestion, such as chewing and swallowing and drinking water with meals and taking our time. And I feel like these are, in our fast-paced life, these are things that get left out of the conversation quite a bit. We probably want to support the liver health and help her detox based on that beta-glucuronidase. There's, you could probably explore that whole system a little further, but that was quite a remarkably high result. We can certainly correct nutrient deficiencies through diet or supplement. Remember, she had low lymphocytes. I had suggested to the provider, we probably want to explore root cause of that a little bit further. And then also, anti-inflammatory with the elevated levels of calprotectin. We want to work on omega-3s, maybe use some curcumin, and then, of course, following kind of an anti-inflammatory diet in light of what she's already doing. So kind of need to kind of pick that apart with the patient one-on-one a little bit more. So just to give you all some closing remarks, the Gut Zoomer 3.0 does provide an immense amount of data, and our goal in our consults that we provide and putting this video together for you is we don't want this to become analysis paralysis. Vibrant's done a really nice job of trying to organize this test so that it can be concise and very actionable. And what I've tried to do for you today is to illustrate how the Gut Zoomer can be combined with other labs on the Vibrant menu to really help illustrate a complete clinical picture so that we can be most productive at intervening with our patients and producing the best outcomes. So thank you for listening to me today. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to speaking with you soon on a consult. Thanks, and have a great day.